All right, it's 2023, a brand new year. My goal this year is to become a web developer. I can't wait. I found this awesome thing online. It's going to teach me all about how to become a web developer. Everything is well laid out. Let's take a look together. I'm so excited. Oh, okay. Well, totally not what I was expecting. I don't even know what any of this means. There's like a DOM, is that someone's name? SQL, and then no SQL. Make up your mind, guys. Do you want me to learn it? Do you want me to not learn it? We got React, we got Git. Well, man, my reaction to this is I'm gonna get the heck right out of here. It's no wonder that most new people learning web development these days have that exact feeling. If you felt that, you should probably know that you're not alone, and most people feel that. In fact, I even still feel that these days when I look at things like this and I just see so much technology, so many new things. Where do I even start? What is even happening? I really wanted to make a video to kind of help out with this process, because I think in this deluge of information and this incredible amount of technology and tools that we have available to us today, becoming a new developer has never been more exciting, but also more complex, because the amount of pathways that we can take has just kind of gotten totally out of hand. So what I've tried to do is to take some of these technologies and put it into a pathway, so that if you're trying to learn web development, and especially if you're new to the field and really want to get started, you have a nice path to actually get started, more like a roadmap to actually go through this journey and have someone hold your hand along the way. So let's just get right to some of this content, because I can't wait to share it with you. I've been putting this together for quite a while. A lot of people have been asking for this, so let's see how far we can get. Okay, so let's look at this, a scary wall of text, first of all, because I think this is a good starting point. So if you're just looking at this, right, and you're just like, what is this? Like, what is even happening here? As I mentioned, you're definitely not alone, right? In fact, these technologies, a lot of people are probably going to say you need to know a bunch of these in order to get into development or web development or software engineering or whatever kind of people want to throw at you these days. Now, while it's true, a lot of these things are very, very important. If you're a new person looking at this field and wanting to get into the field, this is just ridiculous, right? Like, to be fair, no one would, you imagine showing up to like a first course and being like, here you go, we're going to learn like 100 different technologies. That's really a non-starter. So I tried my best over the course of many, many years of teaching this topic and mentoring new developers to see kind of what works and what doesn't, and the real best way to actually get started as a new developer. Now, this has changed drastically over the years. As I mentioned, this specific field of web development has actually increased in complexity quite a lot over the years, hence kind of the conflicting information you might get from different places when trying to learn this for the first time. So without further ado, let's just see if we can condense this into something a little bit more meaningful. So I put together this developer journey, or this roadmap and path for us to follow. Now, I spent a lot of time putting this together. I didn't just throw a bunch of stuff on the screen. I really tried my best with all the experience that I have, as I mentioned, mentoring, seeing people struggle, seeing kind of where the gaps are, to actually put this together. So the purpose of this video is to actually go through each one of these steps so that you can get to a point and you can kind of see where you are throughout this journey and throughout this roadmap, and kind of benchmark yourself to see how far you've gotten. Because sometimes it's also hard to, and you lose track of where you've actually gone, even though you might have learned so much along the way. So let's take a look at this really quick before we actually dive deep into each one of these steps, because I think that's also extremely important. So this is us right here. We're the newbie. We're joining this fresh world of web development. We're super excited, right? We're gonna get our hopes up. We're gonna get through to this all this crazy road, and we're gonna kind of reach the goal, right? So we have a goal. We want to get into the industry. We want a junior position, whatever it happens to be. We want to learn these tools and technologies. In order to get there, we just need the right path. So what is the best way to approach this? I strongly would suggest that the first thing you need to do when you're learning web development is to learn JavaScript. Okay, I'm going to say that again because it's so important, and I feel like even this first step is mixed up a lot when people start. To start learning web development, the best thing you can do is learn JavaScript by itself, vanilla flavor JavaScript. No, frills and frizzles on top of it, just JavaScript. I'm going to go in depth into kind of what this actually means, but what it doesn't mean is learning it alongside HTML and CSS. So those other two technologies, which are usually where people start this journey, HTML and CSS, I think should come after JavaScript, and I'll mention why shortly. Once you have a good handle of JavaScript, you can move over to those technologies that I just mentioned, HTML, which is how to build an actual web page, CSS, which is how to style a web page, and then something called the DOM, which is how these kind of all work together and link up with JavaScript, which is really the programming language of the web that everything is built on, and you can combine these concepts together. If you try to learn these two before you learn JavaScript, it becomes a bit confusing as to what is actually belonging to what part of the language and what is JavaScript and what is not JavaScript. So once you've done these things, I would say that that's a very, very solid introduction, and that'll give you an idea if you even liked this stuff in the first place. You can build a lot of things with just these tools. In fact, entire websites and applications you can build pretty much with just this set of tools. Once you're done that though, you're going to probably notice things are lacking. You're going to want to be able to build things faster. You're going to want to be able to kind of iterate quicker, design things a bit easier. So you're going to reach out for tools, and the most common tool that people use today in web development is something called React. I'm sure you've heard of it before. There's many other flavors and frameworks is what they're called out there. Things like Angular and Vue and Svelte. Doesn't really matter. To be honest, just pick one. In my opinion, you should pick React. It's the simplest to use, easiest to get into, and just the quickest to get started with designing something, thinking about an idea, and then just getting right to the code and actually building it out. And that's going to become much easier once you have these base technologies down. Then, once you're done that, effectively, this encompasses what is really called the front end. I don't really like using the words front end and back end very much, but really this is kind of the visuals, the UI, user interface, the layout of the applications that we're going to be using, the actual physical web pages themselves. What we need to do though is add a bunch of logic, add a bunch of what's called a backend to this front end that we're building so that we can actually do things like store information, do logins, and all that kind of fun stuff. In order to do that, I would suggest the technology that you should learn is something called NodeJS. The reason is that this is actually built on JavaScript so that you can actually use the same technology that you learned at the very beginning throughout this entire journey. You don't have to learn a brand new thing like Python or C# or something like that. You can just stick with JavaScript, and everything that you just built on the front end will transition pretty well to the back end with Node.js. And specifically, you can use a technology called Express to actually build out something called a REST API, which is what I have over here, which allows you to actually do things like talk to a database and store information and respond to questions and queries so that you can build a front end that can talk to it. And we'll show you what this means shortly. Now, at this point in this journey and roadmap, what a lot of people and places do is they immediately want to add extra tools and technologies right away. Now, I think that this is a mistake. There's so much to learn when you're learning Node.js and Express, especially after you literally just learned React, that it's really a non-starter, and people get confused very, very quickly, and things just don't stick, right? So I'm a strong believer in learning this technology as you actually need it and in the context that you actually are going to be using it in, right? That's the real best way to learn these things. So this might not make too much sense right now, but I'm going to mention it because it's super important. And when you do get to this point, hopefully it's valuable for you. When you're starting and you've done your first backend and you're building your first REST API, instead of using a full-fledged database like MySQL or PostgreSQL or MongoDB, I would suggest you just use a plain old text file as your database. Now, I probably sound crazy when I say this, but really, if you can prove to yourself that you actually don't need a database for pretty much most applications that you're going to build, especially at the prototype stage, that is already a huge leap in understanding for why you'll need databases later. So that said, once you've built your first API with that set of technologies and tools, then you can actually transition to learning a real database tool. And the language for that usually is something called SQL, structured query language. And I would suggest you use a tool called SQLite, which is a very easy to use transition from a JSON file to a full-fledged database. So it's kind of the in-between. It works just like a file. In fact, this is the most popular database in the entire world. It's used on satellites, it's used on iPhones, it's used on pretty much everything. So learning it is definitely awesome. Once you're done that, I would build another backend, another REST API, and actually use these other database tools. You can really pick which flavor that you like, MongoDB, Postgres. Again, I'm throwing words out here. I know it doesn't probably really make much sense right now, but hopefully you can maybe screenshot this or come back to it later, and it will when you get to that stage. But it doesn't make sense to actually use these tools right away at the front, at the get-go, because there's so much stuff you have to learn over here that if you try to also add this stuff over here, it's like learning like almost like a new language at the same time, right? It becomes incredibly frustrating, incredibly difficult, and it just really slows you down, and you can't appreciate why you even need those tools in the first place. Once you're done that, you're pretty close to the end of the journey. In fact, you could actually probably start applying for entry-level positions around here, right? If you want to be really next level, optionally, again, I should probably stress this, optionally, you can probably learn these tools that I have here on the bottom right. Specifically containerization through a tool called Docker, everyone's friendly whale, and then the cloud technology. So things like Amazon AWS, Microsoft Azure, and Google Cloud, and things like that, right? If you can learn even a little bit about those tools and even speak to them in things like interviews, that really puts you above and beyond many other candidates who, for example, would probably try to automate that or have something that's already set up for them. Okay. And once you're past that stage, you've hopefully achieved your goal or gotten very close to your goal. It takes a lot of practice. This entire journey and process takes a different amount of time depending on how much time you have per week, depending on your other commitments. But it is definitely possible for everybody, whether it's a couple hours per week in the evenings and on the weekends, or if it's your full-time kind of study. It really is just a matter of scope and scale. Eventually, everybody can get there 100%. I totally believe that. So let's dive into each of these really quick, just so you can actually see what I mean. So step one, I think that JavaScript inside of the environment of Node.js is how you should learn coding from the very start before you even think about HTML and CSS, okay? Now, this is very different from how most kind of roadmaps and tutorials might go, because HTML and CSS are quite simple to get into, and you can get something up on the screen and it's a bit visual. But what you'll notice is you'll immediately start reaching out for JavaScript to actually do stuff that's interactive. And once you start doing that, it becomes very confusing as to what is really JavaScript, what is the browser, what is the DOM, what is React, and all these things get muddled up. So I would highly recommend you learn JavaScript by itself in isolation using a tool like Node.js. I have an entire series on my channel about this. I would obviously biased, but I would recommend learning it that way or something very similar to that style, where you just rely on the technology and the programming language itself, and then you can appreciate what it does and the logic that you can build with it, and then you can go over to the other tools and see what they add to that experience. Now, I have a big do not enter sign here for all our favorite browsers, and this is really to emphasize, please do not actually try to build stuff in the browser at the start, because it gets really confusing as to what JavaScript is and also is not when you start doing that. There are a lot of things on the web that are not part of JavaScript, but it might seem like it, and it becomes really confusing to tease those out when you go to the backend, for example. So once you have that done, then you can go and look at HTML and CSS, which are the two core technologies for the web beyond JavaScript. HTML allows you to structure out the page. You have all these different tags like paragraphs and images and things like that. And CSS then allows you to style the page. Okay, so we can make a blue box, or we can make the card look a little bit orange, right? And we can add a drop shadow and fun stuff like that. And you really should probably learn this alongside something called the DOM, which is the Document Object Model. And this is the part that I mentioned earlier in step one. It is a little bit confusing if you try to learn alongside JavaScript, because this really also is accessible through JavaScript. And I'm going to be creating a course specifically on the DOM, and it allows you to change things in these technologies from JavaScript, okay, and access the page from JavaScript, but it is not part of the JavaScript language. Okay, that's where it gets a bit confusing. So step one, again, just to clarify, the pure logic, pure programming language, JavaScript. And then step 2, you can add these other languages. I wouldn't really say they're languages, but they're kind of like templates to build out the structure of a page and the style of a page. And then this part here is JavaScript to actually manipulate those tools. Then what I encourage you to do is to actually do what's called deploy this technology and this website is probably what you'll end up building to an actual platform. Now, I tried really hard to pick platforms here and tools and technologies that are what's called open source, or at the very least free and easy to sign up with, where you don't need things like a credit card to get started, because I know that's a non-starter for a lot of people. So all these tools and technologies are free and open source, and you can use them for free at your at your heart's kind of content. I'll mention the ones that do require a credit card, but probably won't charge you until you go over their limits. So GitHub Pages, this is a technology that's part of GitHub that you can take your HTML, CSS, JavaScript that you work with to build a website, and you can just say, hey, GitHub, please kind of put this on your server, and I can kind of share it with my friends and family, and anybody can access it. And this will be your first experience actually taking something and putting it on the live internet, which is exhilarating. There is nothing better than actually seeing your stuff online and sharing it with the people that you know, and watching them break it and interact with it. It is totally amazing. So I highly encourage you to actually, once you get to this step, actually deploy it to a platform like GitHub Pages, which has a nice step-by-step guide and is free as well. You just need to create a GitHub account. Okay, I should also mention at this stage, you'll probably start to learn another technology called Git, which was on that initial crazy wall of text that I had. But I purposely didn't include Git in this roadmap because you can kind of learn it in bits and pieces along the way. I know that's a bit controversial because a lot of people are going to spend a lot of time learning Git specifically, but really it's one of those things where if you don't need it, don't learn it until you really, really need it. So just kind of follow the steps to actually get it working and focus on the core technologies like JavaScript, HTML, and CSS. Then step 3. This is step 3. All right. It is React. Everyone's best friend, or some people's not best friend, I guess. Obviously, there's other frameworks like I mentioned, Angular and Vue and things like that. Just stick with React. It's the one that has the most openings online for different positions. You'll find a lot of kind of interview questions for this. It's also the most fun and easy to work with, especially at the start, especially if you know JavaScript quite well. So learn React and build something in React that you just built in HTML and CSS and see the difference and see the time savings that it gives you. This is really the point of this stage. It can be a different project, it can be the same project, doesn't really matter. The main point is to actually see that you can build something very similar to like what you built over here, but just using a new technology that saves you some time, effort, and energy. This step actually is going to take a little while, but don't go too crazy with it because there is really a huge rabbit hole you can go into with React. And this is what people talk about when they talk about the front end usually. I think the most important thing is just to get something up and running, to actually get it deployed, which is the next step, and then to kind of practice that a couple times, rinse and repeat, and build slightly larger and larger sites until you have a chance to actually move to the back end. So that's kind of what I think you should do next is you should do the same thing. You should do exactly what you did with HTML and CSS and deploy your React app to something like GitHub Pages or something similar that's free, right? The steps are pretty much the exact same. It's just the actual process of it and the actual coding of it is just slightly different, and you can see the time savings that it gives you. Then, now we move over to step 4. This is where things start to get interesting. This is diving into the deep back end of the pool per se. So I mentioned that the JavaScript language should be learned using a tool called NodeJS. And while you're doing NodeJS, I think like I should really clarify that I don't mean you should learn Node.js at this point, right? You should learn JavaScript at this point. However, once you get to step 4, now is where you can start to appreciate Node.js. You can do things like access the file system. You can access all these things called APIs in the Node toolkit, as well as add what are called libraries, specifically the library called Express. There are many other libraries apart from Express, but Express is one that is probably the most popular, very similar to React on the front end. I would say that this is basically the back-end version of React, especially in the Node.js world. And this is all in JavaScript, so we're all in the same comfortable programming language that we learned at the very beginning. The goal of this step is to build a REST API. Okay. Now, the kind of details of that are beyond the scope of this video, of course, but this is probably the most important and kind of the starting thing that you'd want to build so that you can eventually have something that your front end can talk to. However, I should mention at this point, two very important things to keep in mind. One, when you're actually trying to access your REST API and see if it works, I would highly encourage you not to use a front end to do that. So for example, don't use React, don't use HTML or CSS or JavaScript on the front end. I would use a tool like Insomnia or like Postman or something like that, where you can actually talk to this REST API purely through there. So you can focus all of your efforts, all of your code on only the back end. The trend here is really to learn things in isolation and then figure out how to glue them together and see why we even need to glue them together in the first place. So this is purely back-end, no front-end at all. Learn how an actual REST API works, learn all the things like put, patch, update, delete, all that kind of stuff, and then test it with a tool like Insomnia. And I should mention the second important thing is use a JSON file as your database. Okay, do not start to whip up a MongoDB instance or a Postgres instance or anything like that, right? Really convince yourself that you actually need those tools before you actually get there. And believe me, when you're first learning this stuff, Node, Express, and things like REST and Insomnia are enough to actually probably confuse you and frustrate you that adding an extra layer of complexity with databases is just totally not worth it and will just frustrate you even more. Once you have that, as you probably would expect, you're going to want to be able to deploy this to the actual intranet so other people can use, and in the future, a front end that you build can use as well. Now, there are a couple of services to do this. This is a different set of services than the front end, like we saw with GitHub Pages, so just be aware of that. Two of the more popular ones these days are these ones I have on the screen, Fly.io and Render. Now, Render is free. Okay, you can sign up and create an account and do everything without any credit card. Okay, it's just a little bit slow, but that's fine for building prototypes. Fly.io is a little bit kind of, I would say, probably easier to use, a little bit more interesting, a lot more features, a bit newer as well. However, also free, but you do need a credit card to actually give them in order to make the account. So I will leave it up to you to decide which one is kind of within your means, all free. But if you don't have a credit card, of course, use Render. If you do, I'd encourage you to use Fly.io. Unless you're uncomfortable with that, then again, just use Render. Now you want to deploy this to the internet so that you can access it from your front end later. But most importantly, you can actually start to see using, again, something like Insomnia, that this tool actually works by querying it and actually seeing your results come back as JSON data. Okay, then we move on to step number 5. Now, the only difference here, right, is adding the front end. Okay, so as you can see, all these tools are the same, right, as step 4. The only one I've added is our friend React over here. Okay, so this is where things become truly, as people say, full stack. Okay, you've built a back end over here. You've previously built a front end over here using a tool like HTML, CSS, or React in this case. What you need to do is glue them together so that the front end can talk to the back end, ask questions, and store data, and then retrieve that data. Okay, and this is the entire point of this process. This is probably one of the harder parts of actually getting into web development, is figuring out how to glue all this stuff together. And arguably, people are going to say, well, I just want to be a front-end developer, or I just want to be a back-end developer. I don't want to learn React. I would highly encourage you not to have that mindset, because to be completely honest, if you can build something like this, regardless if you go to the front end or the back end, it doesn't really matter, because you'll have a really good understanding of how an app works, how the intranet works, how databases work, how generally the things that we use and we're kind of used to day to day work in general. Whether it's a phone app or a random website that we're visiting, you will have a general understanding of just what is happening. And that is so crucial to kind of moving up as a developer as you grow throughout your journey and your career. Okay, so at the very least, you definitely want to be able to build something that's full stack like this. So then once you have that, again, as you guessed it, you want to be able to deploy this. Now, this is probably, again, the trickiest part, because the front end is going to be deployed to something like GitHub Pages, as we saw before. The back end is going to be deployed to something like Fly.io or Render, as I just mentioned, and we need to figure out how to have them talk to each other. So there's some settings that we have to configure in each of these platforms and apps to actually make that happen. But once you have this working, especially at this stage, it is truly remarkable. You're going to probably look at the app and just jump up and down and want to share it with everybody that you know, because it's just amazing. Even if it's the simplest to-do app or a Netflix clone or whatever it happens to be, you will literally be jumping up and down for joy once you actually have this working. I guarantee you, because it is that awesome to see your first deployment actually work when you hook up a front end to a back end. All right, then now is where we get to step 6. Okay, so we're kind of nearing kind of the crest and the end of our journey here throughout kind of learning web development. So once you have a JSON file, the next step is to actually replace that with SQL and SQLite. SQL is the language that we use, so you have to learn a little bit of how that language works, learn how to create a basic table, learn how different keys work, learn how to insert things, remove things, update things, and then the actual technology that you'll use to implement that should be something called SQLite, which is a very, very small, compact, but powerful database tool that uses SQL to store and retrieve information. And this is basically a souped up version of our JSON file previously. It's still just a single file, nothing crazy fancy beyond that, but it is more complex in the sense that we have to access it differently and actually get very conscious with how we structure our data. Once you have that, you can build out the same API, but just replace that storage layer of JSON with SQL and SQLite. And as you guessed it, you can redeploy that and actually test it. Make sure you just test the backend first by itself. Once you have that actually working, then you can actually eventually go over to the front end. I think I messed up my numbers here. This is probably step number 7, but hopefully you're following along. What we want to do after we do that is see if we can actually use the kind of big guns per se. Okay, so notice in step 5, we were using JSON. Step 4 and step 5, we're using JSON. Step 6, we're using SQL and SQLite. And this should be step 7. Now is where we can actually use kind of the production-ready databases. Jumping straight to this actually skips so many things that are crucial to understanding how the technology works at a fundamental level. It is totally not worth it. Do not skip these things. Start with those other two, JSON and then SQLite first, and then you can either build your app out in both Postgres and something like MongoDB, or just choose one or the other, whichever you're probably interested in or want to try to challenge yourself. These are definitely more challenging and will require a lot more setup and effort, both to actually work locally, but also to actually deploy and put into a production like something on Fly.io or Render. But once you have it working, then you're pretty golden, because this is pretty much one of the last stages you'll ever need to deploy something this complex. Anything beyond this is definitely at the very, very high levels of development, which you won't see for quite a while. So again, you want to deploy this to something like Fly.io or Render, and they should support all these different things. There are so many different ways to do this. So I'll leave it up to you to kind of research and explore. However, these tools do support all these technologies, and they are free, which is the most important part. I think this is 7 or 8. I think I'm losing track now. I should probably number these correctly. But then once you're done all of this, again, the next step is to take that technology that you learned as a database and plug it into your front end again. So if you remember back over here, we took our JSON and we plugged it in, JSON database, and we plugged it in with React. Right? Over here, what we want to do is take our Postgres or MongoDB and plug it into React, right? And this is going to add an extra layer of complexity on top of our backend. And the same thing happens here. React can go over here on something like GitHub Pages, for example, or another tool. And then the backend and Postgres specifically as well can go on tools like Fly.io or Render. You can even have like 2 or 3 different tools to actually set this up if you really want to deploy it in different places. Okay. Now, at the very end, I had these 2 tools and technologies. I had the cloud and then I had Docker. Okay, so just a couple of notes on this. I should mention that this is optional. However, if you do go and venture to learn these, it will add so much to your repertoire and understanding and appreciation for how everything that you learn up until this point works. For example, if you actually learn these technologies, you can kind of understand what is happening over here when you're actually pushing to these production tools. So the cloud, this is something like learning Amazon AWS or Microsoft Azure or Google Cloud or many of the other clouds out there like DigitalOcean. And you can actually build pretty much anything you want. It's super custom and you're not really limited to like a small set of tools. You literally have hundreds of different tools and technologies available to you, and the entire intranet pretty much exists on this cloud today, and everything just runs off of it, whether it's a private cloud or a public cloud like something like AWS. Highly recommend you pick one and try to build your app in there. And if you can do that from start to finish, both the front end and the back end, you will learn so much, but it is definitely not necessary in order to actually progress at the beginning, at least. Along with this is a tool called Docker, or specifically containerization. During this process of deployment, you will actually be using something called like a Docker file and containerization. However, you can mostly kind of ignore how it works. By the time you've done it a few times though, you're probably going to be curious as to what this thing even is. And spending a little bit of time, whether that's just a day or two, actually understanding this idea of containerization and kind of the differences between it and previous versions, like what we had with the virtual machines and things like that, will really go a long way. And these two are connected together at quite a fundamental level, so that it'll really help you understand how web apps and other types of apps actually work behind the scenes. So hopefully now, if we kind of come back to our web development journey, right, you can kind of see how that path works, right? You're going to learn kind of the introductory tools, specifically on the front end. You're going to eventually move to using frameworks and then move to the back end, build out REST APIs, use all these different database and storage technologies, and then learn how to actually deploy all those to the cloud, whether that's something simpler like Fly.io or GitHub Pages, or something more complex and more like AWS. Once you've done this entire process, you will be in a really amazing spot, right? You will have learned so much, and looking at pretty much any website, you'll be able to tell, oh, like I think it works this way. I think it does this thing. It must be using this thing over here, right? And that is so powerful and so fundamental to your understanding of web development that I can't stress how important going through the motions of this really is. Now, before we kind of wrap up this video, I just want to go through a couple of tips that I put together because I think this is going to require an entirely separate video, but it's still important enough to actually mention briefly. Now, when you're going through this process, you definitely want to avoid something called tutorial hell, right? If you've heard that term before, what that is really just following along with videos and kind of coding along and nodding your head and saying, yes, I get it. I understand exactly what's happening and this makes sense. And you know what this person is doing. I saw what she did over here. This makes perfect sense, right? That is not the way to learn. You can do that to learn a concept, but to actually implement it yourself with no guidance and no helping hand is the only way to actually have it stick, right? If all you do is follow a course start to finish, what you'll notice is that when you actually finish that course and you're out to start your own project, you're kind of like a deer in headlights, right? You have no idea what's going on. You don't know where to start. So after you learn a concept, build something with it. Do some exercises, learn it, test it, play around with it, and then break it, and then keep doing that over and over again, then move to the next concept, right? Super important. As well, embrace being stuck and frustrated, right? This is so important. I can't really stress enough how important it is. In fact, I would say that when you get stuck and you get frustrated, I think what's most important is just to kind of sit there and just woo-saw a little bit and be like, this is what it means to be a developer, right? Even myself and a lot of my colleagues, we get stuck and frustrated every single day, right? It's just the reality of being a web developer or a developer in general, any kind of software engineer. I would say that to be a really good developer, you have to be able to embrace this and you have to appreciate it and not let it get to you. You have to resist the urge to throw your computer out the window, right? Those are really the best developers. It's part of the learning process, and this skill is really what it is super important to develop. Practice what you learn right away. I mentioned this a couple times already. Don't just blitz through a bunch of stuff. Implement it, build something small, build a project with it, and then keep going. Speaking of projects, you definitely want to build a large project eventually. If you think of those steps and you're actually deploying stuff, you can probably imagine that when people are applying to positions, there is like an abundance of like Netflix clones and to-do lists, right? Those are generally not very interesting to, for example, employers, right? If you build something unique, something of your own, something you're passionate about, maybe you're passionate about a game or a movie or whatever happens to be, or books, right? You can build an app that it revolves around that idea, and that actually serves the other purpose of it being interesting for you. You're not just doing it for the sake of doing it, you're actually invested in the product that you're building and more interested in actually the design and outcomes of it. And you're probably more likely to stick with it and more likely to add more complex features as time goes on. Only learn new technologies as you really need them. It's very tempting at the start to see this huge list of stuff and then get really overwhelmed and try to incorporate it because it's the new hip thing and the new framework du jour, right? But definitely don't do that. Right? Only learn things really as you need them. You need to feel the pain and the struggle as to why you need the thing before you use the thing, right? That really is the best approach to go. I would also say this is definitely quite simple, but so important. Never, ever copy and paste code. Don't do it. Don't ever do it. I do not do it to this day. Even if the code I'm copying and pasting is just one line, and I know it's going to exactly what it's doing, I will write it out myself from scratch. The more that you do this, the better you get at coding, and the more you'll understand everything it is that you're looking up. It's so tempting to copy and paste stuff, but what you're doing is really doing yourself a disservice because you don't learn anything from that process. Actually, writing it out yourself builds that muscle memory, and you'll get so much faster, so much easier by doing that if you just follow this simple process. And last but not least, you really want to just have fun, right? If you're not having fun with this and you're just always frustrated, that is definitely not the way to go, right? And that's why it's so important to pick projects that you're interested in. It's so important to have a good roadmap in front of you and feel like you're gaining confidence and making progress. You want to be able to share this with people that are around you so you can get excited about it, whether that's a community that you're in or your friends and family. So important to have fun and share these projects as you're going through them. All right, so coming back to our map over here, I hope that this video was useful to you. This was a long time in the making for me. I'd love to go into more depth into each of these tools and technologies, but that will be a whole series in and of itself. So I hope you loved this video. If you did, I'd appreciate it if you could subscribe to the channel and like the video as well. I'd love to hear in the comments what you thought of this map. Kind of what process have you gone through yourself? How does it differ from this? What are the things that you got stuck on or kind of held you up or frustrated you during your own journey? And where are you maybe in this process if you are following it yourself? Until the next video, I'll see you later. Have fun out there.